Good morning, everybody. Thanks for that little snippet of a piece of culture that's very important to me. I don't know if you heard that, but that was Men at Work's Land Down Under, which is part of Australia's many shitty music exports to the world. So every time I go somewhere, I would like to, make it a little bit worse. So. My talk is called Front-End Application Bundles, which is a project I'm working on at the moment. But before I start, I just want to say hello, Salt Lake City, because I'm from Melbourne in Australia, which is a long way away. But this is my 4th time in Salt Lake. And it's because every time I come here, I go to a conference or something, and I have a really good time. And I really like the mountains. I think this is the photo from the first time I landed. I'm like, oh, this is a cool place. I came to the first React rally, had a really good time then. So I'm very excited to be back. So thank you for having me. So this is me. My name's Glen Maddern on Twitter. Like Nicole, that's the best place to talk to me. Just slide right into my DMs. And even if you just want to meet up during the conference, just send me a DM. That's the easiest way to get my attention. I'm working on a product called Link, and Fabs, the project I'm going to talk about today, all comes out of that. So I'm not going to have any time to talk about this, but if you're interested in the Fab stuff, come talk to me afterwards. We'll talk about this too. You might know a couple of open source projects that I've worked on. So the first was CSS modules, which I helped to start, which is CSS running through a Webpack compiler. And then I had a bit more of a hand in styled components, which I'm really happy with because it became quite an influential way of doing CSS and JS, particularly in React. A lot of teams are using it, lots of new libraries adopting ideas from it, so I'm really happy with that outcome. Now, I don't work on either of these anymore. Both of them have maintainers. They're doing great jobs. They're both good libraries. You should check them out. What I'm doing is looking at a new thing on a different part of the ecosystem. It's called Fab, or Front-End Application Bundle. And I kind of see it as a stepping stone for a new kind of era of frameworks and meta frameworks for front-end, right? So I'm going to talk about that in most of my talk, but I thought it'd be a good idea to just start with the overall architecture, just give you a sense of what it is. So a fab is a container format, right? You can think of it just like a zip file with a particular structure, because it is. It sits between all the frameworks you want to use, meta frameworks or individual frameworks, and all the places you want to host the code, and simplifies that process and also opens up a whole new world of possibility, basically. The design goal for Fabs is to support any front-end project from the smallest single index HTML file to a client-rendered React app to a full server-rendered framework. And on the other side, it is to run it anywhere that JavaScript can run, right? And now that's not the same as anywhere that Node.js can run, which is traditionally what people think about when they think about hosting a server-side rendered React project. There's one, in particular, one platform that makes a big difference for. So I'll come back to that. But before I talk about how it works and kind of demonstrate that it does work, I want to spend a fair bit of time talking about why I'm working on this and why I think right now is a good time to be introducing something like this. So the best way I know how to do that is to start with a bit of a history of the tech that's got us to here, but also my history and my view of the world. So my first job out of university was in 2005, and I was doing transport modeling. So I was helping to run, writing code that ran simulations that would model traffic jams, figuring out whether you should build bridges or tunnels or new train lines or something like that. Right? I know that the concept of traffic is maybe foreign to people from Salt Lake City because you build roads that are like 16 lanes wide and there aren't enough cars in the world to fill those streets. But in other places it's a big deal. But my point of it, like my excitement in working in that job was because I could make machines dance, right? Came out of university, had some tech skills, had no people skills, and this was an opportunity to just work with machines, right? Write code, really get deep into machines. And it wasn't until like 5 years later, 2010, that I found myself in a position where I was actually writing code on the web. And my first day in this job, they got me to deploy some code, and we talked about the deploy process. We pushed it out, and about 10 minutes later, we looked at the analytics, and 2,000 people had used my code, right, to do some small thing. I'd been programming professionally for 5 years, and I reckon 12 people total had ever run anything I'd written. So this is a huge thing, and this was very addictive to me. I started to realize that software is a way to reach people and help them achieve something, right? And it totally shifted the way I saw my role in the process. The other thing that happened was that I noticed that I was a back-end programmer in a team of back-end programmers, and we had 9 of us, and we had 1 front-end developer who was part-time, right? This is 2010 right there. You know what is interesting, though? This is only obvious in retrospect, because all of us back-end programmers called ourselves full stack, but didn't know HTML or CSS. So I apologize for being one of those people. So 2014, obviously, now we're all doing React. This is what my screen looks like every day. And this is a React conference. We're the cool kids. We're the ones wearing sunglasses now. Like, everything's great, right? And that's kind of true, but it skips an important step. And I went through this step, and a lot of people in this room would have gone through this step, and the tech went through this step, which was that there was a big period where React wasn't around. And it wasn't clear that there was this new level we could all build upon, right? There was no, these ideas were bringing, or these projects were bringing ideas from different places and trying to see if they worked on the web, right? Which was what I was doing too. I was a back-end programmer looking on the web and trying to copy stuff that worked, like desktop UI MVC, and bring it across and see if it works. And I think tech goes through these phases where first you copy what works somewhere else, and then eventually you find a good adaptation. And I think React won the kind of front-end battle in 2013 or whenever it was that it started to gain real traction, because it was the first proper adaptation of concepts that worked in a different domain but worked really well for web UI development. And that's that process that I think is relevant to what's happening today. That process also kind of happened with Docker on the back end a few years earlier. So I'm going to be the first to admit I'm not an expert in Docker at all, and so I don't expect you to know much about Docker. I stopped doing DevOpsy stuff just before it came out. Easiest way for me to understand Docker is that previously servers used to be specific for the code that they ran, right? So you'd have a database server that only run databases, Ruby server for Rails, and JavaScript server or Node.js server for JavaScript. And like a Ruby server or a Node.js server could be as simple as just getting a server and installing Node.js on it. But then that server was custom for that particular task, right? Docker sat in the middle and said, hey, wrap up the code that you want to run as well as the execution environment. So take Ruby code and the Ruby runtime, wrap it in a Docker container, and then on the right-hand side, the resources that you're using, the servers are actually just blank canvases. They can run any task, right? And it's not a particularly complex idea, but it has been profoundly successful, right? I got some stats saying that like 20% of all companies using Postgres do it through Docker, right? 30% of people using Nginx or Redis do it through Docker in production, right? And I think it's really interesting to understand how that happened, right? I don't know if you got this lesson when you heard about Docker for the first time, but this is how it's explained to me, right? The story goes that the most important invention of the 20th century was a box, right? The one invention that changed the world more than any other was this box, right? So the story goes, if you wanted to ship something from somewhere in the world to somewhere else, you would take it from where you manufactured it, you'd throw it on the back of the truck, they'd go to a port, they'd throw it on the back of a boat, one by one, some would get broken, some would get stolen, and the other end, it would repeat itself, and whatever got to the other end got there, right? And then it took somebody's genius to think, well, what about if we put it in a box, right? And then people couldn't get inside. It wouldn't get broken, wouldn't get stolen, right? And then this is claimed to have revolutionized the entire modern world. The second half of the 20th century, the globalization, the rise of manufacturing in countries all around the world, and the death of manufacturing in other countries is attributed to the genius of the box, right? And it's not a bad story, but it's not what happened, right? Because there were boxes before that box, right? So that's called the intermodal container, and it was a good box, right? Like it was cheap to manufacture, it was very strong, and when you put two on top of each other, they locked in, so they were on the back of a boat, they didn't fall over, right? But that's it. I mean, it was a good box, but that's not why it's successful. Why it was successful is because it was the first globally open source box. So they gave away the patents, which is the equivalent of open sourcing that code, right? It became a standard, right? So instead of throwing it on the back of a truck, you would pack the box at the factory. So if you're manufacturing something in Salt Lake City, I don't know what you manufacture here, salt, maybe it's salt, right? So you go to the lake and you pick up a bunch of salt, you put it in a container, and then that container goes to the other side of the world, and it arrives in exactly the same state, right? And it's that idea that it could go global with the same box. But it's not the shipping that changed. It's the fact that the truck that you put it on was made by a Japanese company, and the boat that it sailed on was made by a Chinese one, and then the train in India that was delivering salt to people was also all compatible with this one standard. This intermodal container was global, right? And that's that concept of standardization that enabled each individual company to grab a piece of that logistics chain and improve it. And that's what revolutionized global shipping. And in that sense, there were plenty of containers before Docker, right? Docker didn't invent the idea of putting software in a box. There's a lot written about how Docker has a different architecture to the virtual machines that came before it. And Docker, yes, it's better, yes, it's smaller, yes, it's a better box. But what it did was it put what was useful together, made it open source, and made it run everywhere. So when Docker hit the scene, it wasn't like React. It wasn't trying to compete in a place with a bunch of different ideas. It was trying to outcompete closed source ecosystems or platforms, right? So you had, at the time, places like Amazon and Heroku and VMware doing cool stuff, but it was totally closed into their ecosystem. And when Docker came along and grabbed ideas from those, it didn't replace those platforms. It just stopped what those platforms had to build. They didn't have to build each other's features for all this basic stuff. They could build the thing that made them different, the thing that was actually innovative. And it changed the last 10 years of back-end software development quite profoundly. And so I see our current situation with front-end applications as like being in those couple of years before something changes, right? And I'll tell you why I see it as kind of like a dark age of front-end, even though it's the best it's ever been. And that's because I think there's this huge dichotomy between static and dynamic front-end applications. So I'm calling front-end applications anything that's like done as a single project, usually React or one of the other JavaScript frameworks. But it's a self-contained thing. It's not something that lives inside a Rails or a PHP app. You kind of have this choice to make. Do you go static or do you go dynamic? And because there's a huge difference in the complexity and the performance and the trade-offs, that is a big decision to make at the beginning of the project. Do you go with the runtime or performance implications of having a statically rendered site, but then making it easier to develop, or do you go with slightly more complex development process, but better performance? My problem isn't that one of those is better than the other. My problem is there's no gentle ramp between the two, right? If you start static, it's very hard to gradually migrate to start doing server rendering. And if you start server rendering, you have to take on a lot of complexity up front. And I think the reason is that everybody starts with the end in mind, right? Which is natural. Like the web is for shipping software to users. That's who the web is for. And so it's very natural to start with the idea and look at these products and say, hey, that's how I'm going to host, so therefore that's how I have to build. And I think the problem comes when you look at the difference in capabilities and ease of use of all of these different platforms. Right? So Netlify is the static host that I always dreamed of. It's beautiful, right? It runs excellent. And as you go down, things start to get a little less fun. Right down to the point where you go like, hey, no, let's just do it. It's just software. Let's just use it like a back-end program. Let's just use Docker. And then you get into a position where you have an index HTML file, right, running on something that was designed for Postgres or Redis on Nginx. Right? And that's, I would say, the copying phase of the process, right? You take what works on the back end and just use it for the front end. And I think we can do better. But I think in general, what I'm talking about here is a kind of back pressure, right? From the end goal that then influences our design of our frameworks and our meta frameworks. Or another way to put it is that our platforms are holding us back. I'll give you some examples. Static hosting is so good, it changes how frameworks evolve. Get my cursor out of the way. So the example here, like the classic example here is Gatsby, right? Gatsby is a fantastic project run with really talented developers. And yet, for my money, it's constrained by an architectural decision that everything can always be compiled to a static site. That, to me, means that as your site grows, and ask anybody who's got a decent-sized Gatsby site, those build times start to get bigger. They start to get slower, and you start to question the wisdom of recompiling and regenerating every page when you just changed one piece of data. Right? Now, I know that Gatsby is actually working on a solution. I don't know if they've shipped it yet, but I know that they're in progress. I believe that that project will be fine, but I can't help but wonder if you could host a dynamic site just as easily as you could host a static site, whether they would take a different approach, right? Whether they would abandon that architecture and go for something more like a hybrid system. So the other example is Next.js and Now, right? So this is a company site that can control both ends of that spectrum, right? The hosting environment in Now and the development time environment in Next.js, right? They can iterate, right? They can innovate. And I think they're probably the people doing the most exciting work at the moment because they're kind of the only group that can, right? So I'm super excited for everything they build, and I really like Next.js 9. I think it's a huge step. And I encourage you to use it. If you haven't looked at Next for a while, it's really good. But I'm not super happy with this situation, right? I don't like the barrier to entry to being that you have to look at the whole ecosystem. I think open source is best when an individual or a group of people can pick a small section of the problem and design a solution and get it out there and get people using it and learn from it. This is like the containerization, right? Once you have a standard, people can pick a small part of the ecosystem. And until that point, you have to be someone who can manufacture trucks and boats and trains to introduce a new box. The other thing I think is about to happen is React is about to mess the world up in terms of what you can do with server rendering, right? So they've been hinting this for a little while. They talked about it having been released by now, but it's the React team, so it's always going to take a bit longer, but it's going to be good when it comes out. My guess is it'll come in the next 12 months. So there was a talk at Zeit Day last year where Andrew Clark hinted at this, and this is still, I think, the only time the code has ever been on the screen. It certainly was the only time I could find it. Oh, great, it's a new version of my bloody software, thank you. All right. So what this is doing, and this, I love this, which is that you're rendering on the server, and the server detects using a suspense boundary that, hey, I need to fetch some data. I'm sorry that this isn't more zoomed in, but this is the best I could do. Hey, I need some data. So the first thing I'm going to do is wait about 100 milliseconds to see if that data is really nearby. Maybe it's in a cache really, really quick. And if it comes back in time, I'm just going to send down the DOM like normal. But if it doesn't, I'm going to start sending down chunks of the DOM in script tags using this thing like window.ssr process. Basically, because when you're streaming data down to a client, the HTML connection stays open, you can kind of keep adding more info, and the browser will just keep executing it. It's as if it's just been slow to download, but you can hold that connection open and keep delivering more content. So in this example, they deliver a loading screen with a spinner. And then as data comes in, they flush the different parts of the DOM. It's like VDOM diffing, but across the network, right? It's a really cool idea. And in terms of that difference between interactivity or the perceived performance, this is going to have a huge impact. This is being written because Facebook.com is moving to this model, right? But even if that's not all that, I still think that there's so much innovation that could happen, right? My dream is a version of React that doesn't even send JavaScript to the client. Just sends down the DOM and does like nothing but virtual DOM diffing. Now, I don't have time to build that, but I'm hoping that someone else does, right? Because I think it'd be awesome. If you could detect that a device isn't powerful enough to run your fancy JavaScript and just send down HTML, but your entire design team could be using their React components and their design systems that they've worked so hard to finally get, and you never have to compromise, and the user gets the best experience, then I think that's super awesome. But it's never going to happen if the best way to host stuff is still static. The other thing I think is an indication that we're in a dark age is a thing called Cloudflare Workers came out, which is awesome, and nobody's using it, right? Like, I don't work for Cloudflare, but this thing is great, right? So 193 locations. You can deploy to it within, I don't know, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Your code is running everywhere in the world simultaneously, right? Some of the coolest tech I've ever seen, but it's not really a host. It's just a serverless framework that runs JavaScript. If only there was a way to use them. So that's where I think Fabs can come in, right? I think Fabs wedge into the space is letting you use Cloudflare Workers. I think that's a really good first use case for them. Now, I'm not going to go into the documentation or the details particularly deeply at all. If you're interested in the concept, I'm going to be here for the next 2 days, and also just go to the website and read the documentation. But I'll give you the high-level overview. So when I said that a Fab was like a zip file, it's because it is a zip file with two components. One is a single server JavaScript file, and the other is a directory of all your assets. And this is enough to build any front-end framework, server-rendered, client-rendered that I've ever seen. It can all come down to this, right? Compiling a server-rendered framework to a single server file isn't easy. That's where most of the complexity and time has been. But Webpack has been doing that stuff for ages, right? And Browserify before that. It was making code that was assumed that it had a file system, assumed that it had lots of other files to include, and make it run in the browser. It's been doing that for ages. So I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just putting this together. And the assets, the other thing we did with assets is that there's only one place for anything to live, and it's inside a predictable directory, which is /_assets. It's guaranteed to be immutable. So if you have favicons or any other files, we will hash it as part of the process, so you never have to worry about storing it. It means that you can store it permanently and never worry about it. So each fab becomes a representation of a single state of your app, and it comprises of these two parts. So if you've got a fully static app, then most of your work is in the assets directory. Again, Webpack chunks, doesn't matter like how complex your client-side code is, it all fits inside assets. And your server.js might be quite empty, but if you've got a very server-rendered file, your server.js might be quite big. Then you get a choice. You either deploy it as a single unit to an area that can host static files, like Heroku or Docker, or Now, as well as execute JavaScript. Or what I'm interested in is you can split them up, and you can deploy them as two separate parts. So for me, the best option to deploy that stuff is to host the server.js on Cloudflare Workers and all the assets on S3, because S3 is sort of bulletproof. So if this is the goal for Fabs, right, any front-end project, anywhere you can run JavaScript, then by starting with the most complex server-side framework that I could find, and the coolest and fastest and hardest to use platform, Cloudflare Workers, that means we're in a pretty good position to support everything else. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate now. And I'm not going to do a live demo because I have done this before. And I am just going to play a pre-recorded live demo. All right, so there's a thing called Create Next App, which will let you just get started, right? And Create Next App is obviously updated with version 9, so it's the easiest way to get going. I'm just going to pause this as I go. So you jump into this directory, and the first thing you have to do is you have to change the default config of Next. But this is the only thing you need to do. So by setting the target to serverless, you're basically targeting it for now.sh's infrastructure, which turns out to be a lot more adjacent to what Fabs need than the default build. The other thing is you set the asset prefix to /_assets, because that's what Fabs expect. The next step is simply to install the Fab compiler for Next.js, which I didn't speed up the video enough anyway. And then you build Next.js and then compile it into a Fab. I typed really slowly at that time. Now, this is kind of important, which is that the fab step happens after the build step, right? So, and this is in general for all the fab tooling that's out there so far. The first thing you do is build it like normal, and then fab compiles it down into a fab. In the future, we might have better integration with some of these frameworks and meta frameworks to do a specific, a separate build step. So at the moment, I'm looking at a create React app build step instead of running their normal build, because so much about create React app is predictable. But what this does is it generates a fab.zip file, which for a basic Next.js app is 284K, and it just sits there in your directory. And the final step, after doing some auth stuff that I didn't want to show, is you execute the Cloudflare Workers deployment, which splits it up, creates a bucket on S3, puts all the files there, and then takes the server.js, uses Wrangler, which is the Cloudflare Workers command line tool for uploading it, and it takes about that long to release, right? And so now my code is running in 193 data centers around the world, right, from a basic Next app. So if I now go, oh, thanks. So we now go here. That's it, right? That's running on my glen.workers.dev. So if you haven't used Cloudflare Workers, they recently brought out something like 30 free scripts that come under your own Glen, your name.workers.dev. So go to workers.dev, sign up for it there, and then you can start playing around with this stuff. You can also host it to your own domain, but I didn't have time to show that. But just to show you what this kind of means is, like, there's a lot of things to do for performance, but one of the best things you can do is push your rendering code to the edge, right? If you have static code, that kind of happens for you because a CDN is doing that. It's copying it out to the edge. But I ran this through this performance tool, and this is unoptimized. This is the first version. Like the Fab Next.js stuff only exists on my laptop. I haven't released it yet. This is the first version of it. And yet the performance is excellent, right? I'm really happy with that. And so if I just jump back to my slides for the last little thing, because I'm now over time. Oh my God, where did it go? What? What? Does that work? Hey, okay, cool. Ah, such a professional. So this is basically the status of the project, right? So this is our goal as our version 1, to support all of the things on the left and all of the things on the right. And we're getting pretty close. All of these exist as well, they're all proved as a concept. Anything with a shush is because I haven't released it yet. One of the challenges that I'm working on a product and the fab spec is being built to support that product. So the first step is do it for the product and then do it for the customers and then eventually open source it. So a lot of this stuff is still in that phase and the documentation still needs a lot of work. That's what I'm going to be working on the next couple of days. But you can head to fab.dev and check it out. If you want to see some of the cool stuff that you can do with a fab, you can head to Link. If you've already building to a fab, you should be able to sign up to Link in about 30 seconds, maybe less. That's all I've got. Thanks very much.